We find ourselves in an era where all experiences are twisting and turning in radical ways, where the borders no longer hold, which compels us to develop an entirely new philosophy of movement as we approach the future. But this requires a new methodology as well. We can no longer simply analyze existing or elapsed events, which then puts us 3 steps behind reality. But rather we have to learn precise techniques of projecting thought 3 steps forward into the dark corners and unknown horizons beyond. Like an archer who shoots ahead of its moving target, we must become masters of speculation and intuition. Like professional gamblers or martial artists, we must anticipate possibilities and strike according to unfolding patterns, rhythms, and signs. In this presentation, we will trace some of the most unique experiments with movement as they intersect with 3 further concepts: time, space, and identity. To speak about futuristic time does not always mean a complete annihilation of the past, but rather we must understand the future as a whirlwind that summons back all conceivable times before it. This is why so many films today are set in long-lost epics of the ancient or medieval worlds, fantasizing about exotic time periods that have since faded away. Hence, there is always a suspicious question of what older ideas we are perhaps resurrecting and wrenching back into play as we move into the futuristic beyond. To unlock these parallels, we have to break down our thinking of movement and time into more molecular concepts that bind them together in intriguing ways. In philosophy, these are often the most important conceptual territories when thinking about different states of time and their influence on movement, including speed, slowness, stillness, spontaneity, waiting, cyclicality, disappearance, return, haunting, origin, eventuality, doom, duration, dread, memory, forgetting, erasure, and nocturnality. We can start tracking this relationship between past paradigms and future paradigms of movement in the following example: a cutting-edge library built in 2017 in Tianjin, China, with over 1.2 million books that stretch from floor to ceiling in uneven arcs. Notice that the texts are arranged in states of perpetual movement, circulating no longer in solid forms, but in more formless states of liquidity or aeriality, like waves or clouds. Thus, the visual design itself resembles either a whirlpool or tornado. But what if we discovered that the futuristic design patterns of this library were in fact inspired by a 13th century mountain fortress built by Arab architects in southern Spain? This is the ceiling of the Alhambra Palace of Granada. In this medieval imagination of movement, one can see how the ceilings and walls break and flow into excessive geometric fractals, one after another. The intent here is to simulate infinity itself, which in turn looks like a labyrinth of tunnels, corridors, and angles, something to mirror the endlessness of the cosmos. And also the idea of illuminated movement is the same between the futuristic library and the medieval palace, one using artificial light and the other natural light, pouring through windows in order to magnify everything in a kind of halo effect. Here we find another compelling example. Opened recently in Hangzhou, China, this futuristic bookstore makes use of movement by plunging visitors through a wonderland of optical illusions, circular rooms, and spiral shelves that often feel like being on a Ferris wheel or merry-go-round. What many don't know, however, is that this glass universe of the Hall of Books is actually based on a medieval Persian design of the Hall of Mirrors, which also uses trickeries of light and reflection in order to make one feel as if they are levitating or drifting across smooth, radiant surfaces. And even if we turn to the visual arts, like this image by the Italian artist Alessandro Bavari, and observe the most technically sophisticated portraits of human beings in futuristic motion, something that he calls metachaos, one notes that almost every choreography therein is in fact just a slightly distorted echo of older techniques of movement taught by ancient tribal warriors, mystics, and martial artists. So again, we see the notion that futuristic concepts of movement are indeed rehearsals of every other historical epoch at the same time. But let us go further to ask, what are the ancient categories of movement? From the stories of the very earliest civilizations, we uncover four major types of movement which filled their cultural legends. Those of nomadism, tied to survival; heroism, tied to the journey; discovery, tied to adventure, exploration, and conquest; and afterlife, which described the movements of the eternal. As a consequence, this gave rise to four archetypal characters in ancient myths: that of the wanderer, the hero, the explorer, and the dead, all of whom move in highly particular ways and are tied to specific destinations and destinies. In speaking of nomadic existence, we can look upon this oasis monument of Petra, Jordan, for such grand ruins were once a place where ancient traders, caravans, and desert Bedouins would gather. In speaking of heroic tales, we can look to those European banners of the Middle Ages, depicting figures who abandoned their homelands in search of glory. We see them almost always advancing towards perilous danger to combat some horrific being, a dragon or demon, in order to win certain powers. In speaking of the earliest explorers, we can look to the ancient maps of the Mediterranean empires. Fascinating here is that ancient map makers would often have to invent lands and areas that had not yet been charted. And in those unknown zones, they would implant all kinds of magical sea creatures as obstacles. Notice that today we do the same thing in our alien-obsessed films about outer space. Psychologically, this mirrors the sheer terror of the first sailors who glided toward what they thought were the edges of the earth on fragile wooden ships, knowing that they were playthings of ocean storms, and also that beneath the planks under their feet was a black infinity full of strange beings that writhed and devoured one another in the cold water below. And finally, in speaking of movement through the afterlife, we can look to the Egyptian temple of Dendera. This is a miraculous example of ancient architecture, where astrological images from the Egyptian Book of the Dead were painted across the roofs and pillars, showing dead pharaohs crossing otherworldly star rivers in large skyboats, and guided by gods and goddesses who are often half animal or half alien. With this rich backdrop in place, how can we start deciphering the futuristic principles of movement and time? Do we have to invent altogether new theories of the passenger, the vehicle, and the drift? Do our discoveries of moving at the speed of light altogether change what it means to wander, struggle, explore, or even die? Are we moving at such obscure velocities that we can no longer tell the difference between emergence and vanishing, appearance and disappearance, arrival and departure? Are we rotating in states of permanent disorientation, where it seems we're plunging constantly through broken fragments of time, like endless capsules or shards of a shattered hourglass? Moving onward, we can now ask our second question of how futuristic movement dramatically changes the way we conceive of space. For the technological advancements of our era increasingly allow us to navigate both far-reaching scales and minuscule spatialities of movement, from molecular to cosmological motion. Again, we must focus our thinking of movement and space into more refined concepts that bind them together in intriguing ways. In philosophy, these are often the most important conceptual territories when thinking about different themes of space and their influence on movement, including confinement, openness, abandonment, entrance, exit, escape, invasion, flight, immensity, ruin, distance, closeness, atmosphere, interiority, exteriority, navigation, desolation, softness, flatness, jaggedness, depth, and surface. Futuristic space is full of paradoxes, which means that our imagination fuses together what were once considered totally opposite states. The three most crucial paradoxes of space are the infinitesimal and the universal, fluidity and fragmentation, and structure and boundlessness. Our first example is from Argentinian contemporary artist Tomás Saraceno, who made an exhibition of spiderwebs preserved in glass cases. Speaking of our first paradox of futuristic movement, how the infinitesimal and the universal collide, Saraceno was inspired by the fact that scientists have said that these complex interwoven networks of the spiderweb are the only thing in nature that actually mirrors star and planetary constellations. Later, it was noted that these webs are also the only thing in nature that mirror the delicate system of receptors and signals found in the human brain. So from a creature's small habitat to the inner workings of our consciousness to the most remote faraway galaxies, we have a corresponding logic of movement. Along a similar axis, new video and digital art designers are using this correlation between the primordial infinitesimal threads of spiderwebs and the connections of outer universes to imagine new topographies of space. Thus, they deploy algorithms that will build new futuristic worlds based on configurations of mobile strings and strands. The second paradox of futuristic movement in space is fluidity and fragmentation, which is what one sees manifested in any major metropolitan center of our current world, but noted best here in the Shibuya district of Tokyo, Japan. The busiest intersection in the world, streaming with people walking in perfect synchronicity, and yet the relation between them is one of both pure continuity and pure alienation. They are seemingly together, but never looking at each other. A more ominous replication of this paradox, however, is in the mass migrations that we observe across the globe among displaced societies. Contemporary photographer Richard Moss won the most renowned photography award for his series called Heat Maps, which used heat-sensing cameras to capture the movement patterns of refugees in refugee camps. Here we see the same ideas of fluidity and fragmentation in the camps as one finds in the urban life of global cities. The not yet constructed Analemma Tower is the final example of our third paradox, that of the futuristic movement between structure and boundlessness. Designed by the famous Clouds Architecture Office and now confirmed to be built in Dubai in the next few years, it will be the world's tallest skyscraper that actually hangs from space, suspended from an orbiting asteroid. It will therefore be in perpetual slow-spinning motion, and residents will have to use parachutes to descend to the earth. Our final interest concerns that of how futuristic movement will forever alter our notions of identity. Futuristic trends are already blurring the lines between the human and the animal, the vegetal, the elemental, the monster, the virus, the object, and the machine. Traits that were once exclusive to the inhuman are now becoming intimate parts of human experience. If we begin with those entities that human beings have always feared, we notice that it is largely because of their disturbing patterns of movement. The way the insect crawls, the reptile slithers, the rodent scurries, they are all part of our fear of small things. And why have we feared them for thousands of years? Because of their unpredictable motions, streaking along sudden and non-linear paths, because they invade in multiplicities, in packs and swarms that overwhelm us in their sheer number, and because they disappear, going in between the walls and floorboards where we cannot follow. Also, our definition of the monster is based largely upon their movement patterns. Thus we tremble upon seeing the ghost float, the vampire hover, and the zombie and mummy stagger. Philosophers and mystics have always been outsiders as well, staring up into skies and stumbling in states of wisdom and entrancement. Like the monster, our definition of so-called dangerous types also have much to do with movement, such that we need only picture the pirates chasing in search of fortune, the criminal moving against the law, and the runaway abandoning themselves to the streets. Beyond this, we can contemplate the way archers follow trajectories and guerrilla soldiers use asymmetrical war, alongside the unique movements of circus performers, tightrope walkers, and dancers. But let us go here now, into the office of Fernand Deligny, a French psychologist from the 1930s to the 1960s who worked at asylums for severely autistic children. Their parents would bring their children to his institution and beg him to teach them to speak. Though after several exercises, Deligny soon observed that these patients would experience extreme frustration, shame, and stress attempting to acquire language. Then one day, the other physicians noticed Deligny in the hospital courtyard, sitting on a bench with a journal of odd diagrams. When asked what they were, Deligny replied that he finally realized that the autistic children did indeed express themselves, but that instead of language they did so through movement. Hence his book of drawings was his attempt to trace their steps and motions while they played outside, so that he could learn how better to treat them over the coming years. And he did so with brilliant success. He inhabited their universe of swaying and sidestepping as hidden doors into their consciousness. Where others had dismissed them as lost causes of society, he alone honored their humanity by studying their elaborate movements above all else. Next, we turn to the Dutch artist Theo Jansen, who creates what he calls strand beasts on the beaches of Scandinavia, or rather kinetic sculptures made of mere plastic. These well-crafted beings of his can move in complicated routes. They can sense wind and water, and are usually modeled after animal or insect movements that he has studied. He uses the intricate skeletal structures and evolutionary habits of these creatures to enable his sculptures to actually react to their environment. For instance, some of his strand beasts can sense when they arrive from the sand to the ocean water and then turn back, while others will anchor themselves to the ground if they sense a storm is coming. Thirdly, we can turn to the Hungarian dance duet known as Non Solus, for their performances have generated a new form of movement that comes from the combination of two identities who usually never collaborate. Namely, one is a classically trained dancer, and the other a circus acrobat, resulting now for the first time in a ballet performed vertically in midair. And lastly, the Dear Moon Project is an enterprise financed by Japanese billionaire entrepreneur Yusaku Maezawa. According to a recent announcement, he has decided to send a SpaceX starship to circle the moon filled with various artists: a painter, sculptor, composer, novelist, architect, filmmaker, photographer, chef, and fashion designer, who he believes will be creatively inspired by such travels to the outside of their known frontiers. We do not know what they might perceive and construct upon return, and whether the voyage will induce visions of tranquility or terror, enlightenment or madness. But we do know that they will not come back the same, thereby confirming our suspicion that futuristic modes of travel will bring forth entirely unforeseen experiments with identity. So it is that being itself has now become haunted by a mysterious question mark. For to move differently through worlds is no less than to inevitably transform what it means to exist.